wonder if I should do the Cameron Bertuzzi thing where I just hold that for a really long time. I could do the Mike Winger thing where it's like, ooh, this is awkward. Oh, I can't bring the cats over to do cat cam. Could pull a Jonathan Pritchett and talk away from the mic. Pretend I'm not looking at Braxton. Or I could just go with me being me. How's it going, everyone? This is Nick. Welcome to the New Testament Theologist YouTube channel, where we do New Testament theology nerdy things. And today, instead of being a little more structured, for lack of a better word, or having a specific telos or where we're going, this video, like some of the other Patron Q&As, is a little less formal. So you'll have to forgive me. I'm feeling a little under the weather. Don't think it's the Rona. I don't have any of the symptoms. It's just one of those where you just don't feel particularly great. My guess is moving. You can see about, oh my goodness, my mother would have words for me if she saw me yawning in front of everyone. Oh my goodness. I could cut that out, but and I realize I probably made every single one of you just yawn right now, and the power of that thought is just wonderful. Anyway, feeling all right, not feeling great, all that sort of stuff. So I think it's just the stress from the move and the job hunt and everything. But just wanted to say thank you to the new patrons who showed up. It's always awkward. I'm never sure if I can list out names of people, but you know who you are. A few folks for January. It's awesome to have you here. And the new video has been popping like gangbusters. The response to Mike Winger, great guy, but just felt it deserved a response. Some of the stuff he said on Ephesians 5. Thanks to the commenters, a lot of what you've said has been very encouraging, and the pushback has been helpful. It's always, never wrong to go deeper into what you're thinking and probing questions and stuff. So thanks for making that video go, for me at least, viral. I mean, for viral for me is 300 views, but slowly growing, and it's just water tonight, trying to be healthy. And just third, just a great hangout yesterday. We had our first Zoom patron hangout, and it was wonderful just meeting, putting a face and a voice to everyone. Thank you to everyone who showed up, and sorry we missed some of you, but we'll do these once a month, and it'll be just informal hangout time. So if you missed this one, no worries. You can hit us up next time, and we'll go through all of that. But it was a wonderful time of fellowship, wonderful time of just praying for everyone and learning from everyone, and just spending time together and seeing where everyone's coming from on their journey of faith and all the theology stuff that we're all thinking about. So it was a great time hanging out yesterday with all of you, and I was very enriched and blessed by it. So thank you for your encouragement and your support. So Ezekiel asked the first question. He asked, do you know anyone who lays out a thorough argument on either side of the complementarian egalitarian debate that addresses why Adam is used in contrast to Christ rather than Eve? And that's Romans 5. He's thinking of the famous Adam-Christ typology. It also appears in 1 Corinthians 15. But also why Eve, rather than Adam, is used as an example of believers being led astray, 2 Corinthians 11, and how each example has anything to do with gender. You mentioned earlier that your wife has done some work on Eve. So yes, my wife is doing her PhD on Eve. That's, of course, been expanded to include material in the whole of 1 Timothy 1 through 3, or at least chapter 1 through chapter 3, 1a. So she has some interesting arguments there. I think I'm persuaded by most of them. But what I've noticed, it is very rare for anyone to actually make the gender of Adam or Eve specific. You'll find people that'll do it, but it's kind of like the same sort of argument that goes, well, Jesus is male, ipso facto complementarianism, or what have you. You don't see it in a lot of scholarly literature. I mean, you can find it in scholarly literature, but I'm not aware of anyone who makes a huge case out of that. Bruce Ware, I know, makes that case. Egalitarians tend to stay away from kind of ontological arguments or ontologically based arguments like that. It's usually complementarians that go there. A lot of what I've seen with the Adam Christ material I mean, this might be just, I posted a Romans 7 debate that I did with David Lewis. Great guy. I think it was on Cole Perkins' channel. It feels like it was forever ago, but it was probably a year ago. And I take the Adamic reading of Romans 7. Specifically, Paul is using what's called prosopopoia, where he impersonates or speaks in the form of a character. And the character he adopts to make a rhetorical point, or a rhetorical slash pedagogical point, is Adam. So he kind of adopts the Adamic voice in the first half of chapter 7. And in the second half of chapter 7, he talks about the Adamic person, the person in Adam, as opposed to the person being in Christ. And of course, the famous ending of that is that there is now therefore no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, as opposed to being in Adam. As we've seen, Adam is kind of at least alluded to, the Genesis account is alluded to in Romans 1, but is most explicitly brought forward in Romans 5. The famous through one man sin, then therefore through one man's righteous act, so on and so forth. So Ezekiel's question, you'll find some complementarians making this argument, but it's not usually a central pillar. Bruce Ware, I believe, has done some argumentation like that. The pushback is usually from egalitarians is that while you are free to make the argument that Adam and Christ ipso facto gives some sort of male preeminence or male headship, Paul doesn't seem to be doing that. The closest you might get is the passage in 1 Timothy, where you have, rather than it being Adam being given preeminence, it's Eve being given preeminence as the one who fell into transgression and was deceived. And even then, you might have the issue if Romans 7 is Adamic, we might say, then you have the language of deception there. Let me see if I can. I'll just pull it up. I've got that kind of time. And just translation-wise, I usually just go with the NRSV. I find them to be the least biased, and that's not to say there's no bias, but I find them to be the least biased. And I find I have less explaining to do as I use the passage. So, for example, in Romans 7:7, it says, "What then shall we say?" So, and this is the Adam, that the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. Adam. I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, "You shall not covet." But sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. Apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died, and the very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. For sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and just and good. Did what is good then bring death to me? By no means. It was sin working death in me through what is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin, and through the commandment might become sinful beyond measure. And then it goes in to talk about being sold into slavery under sin, and kind of, this tension of, the Adamic person or the Adamic reality, the sin, death, Adam kind of, unholy trinity. And so that's not to give a full explanation of the Romans 7 debate. I think David gave as good an explanation as you can for kind of I believe it was the Christian Experience reading. I could be wrong on that, but I thought it was a helpful debate. I think where I shined in that one personally was on the pastoral side of it, what it means pastorally to teach and preach on the Adamic reading. But all this to say, if Romans 7 does have kind of echoes of Adam in it, then you do have Adam being deceived here. As Eve was deceived, and in 2 Corinthians, so I'll go to 2 Corinthians 11, not 2 Corinthians 2, 2 Corinthians 11, and that's verse 3, but I'll start in verse 1. I wish, and this is Paul, I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness. Do bear with me. I feel a divine jealousy for you, for I promised you in marriage to one husband to present you as a chaste virgin to Christ, and that is the whole church. Present you in marriage to one husband to present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. So already you hear echoes of Ephesians 5 here. It's not as if Paul is creating, some people don't think Paul wrote Ephesians, but already here you can see kind of some sort of seeds of that here, what the husband does in Romans 5 or Ephesians 5. But I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. then he goes on to talk about a different Jesus and what one people do, and it bases the problem of Galatians in some sense. But what is interesting here is the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, not by her nature, but by its cunning. The issue here is not that women are more easily deceived; it's that the serpent is very cunning, and that's a nuance that I think Paul picks up on. And so, a lot of what we see in kind of the Adam, Christ, and Eve parallelism, and maybe I'll just have to ask my wife. Actually, she might actually have something on YouTube. Ezekiel, let me see. She had I'll just say Allison Quint on YouTube. Okay, so there was that one. Where is her CBE thing? She had a CBE. Oh goodness, where is it? She actually had a CBE presentation. Oh goodness, Alice. Sorry, I'm typing on the fly. Where is it? Anyway, she has something called Ecclesiology in I'll share the video on the I'll try and share the video in the description. But if you just if you look for Allison Quint, my last name, Ecclesiology, the first one will show up, and it's a video where.
And I'm a PhD student in systematic theology with a minor in New Testament, and I hope to share with you today some of my research on 1 Timothy 2. I will be trying to argue that Eve is a type of Christ, much like Adam is a type of Christ in Romans 5.
So if you're interested, and she has since developed this was back when I believe she was doing her PhD at Fuller, and then she transferred to Aberdeen. But Ezekiel, if that's interesting to you, that might give some sort of reasoning why Eve is actually used in this example here. So not to belabor the point, but there's really the people only really making the argument that there's a gender hierarchy based on the maleness of Adam are few complementarians, but usually that's not the argument that's being made in the literature, at least that I've seen. I could be wrong on that. So hopefully, I'll put that in the description so y'all can see. Or if I don't, comment on the YouTube video and remind me, and I'll do it. It's tomorrow, and the next few days are going to be very, very busy. So that's Ezekiel's first question. And so the next question is from my friend Joey. Do you think our definition of sin, disobeying God or acting in a way contrary to our role as imagers or as image bearers, is a neutering of the doctrine of sin we see in the New Testament? I know you've talked briefly about that apocalyptic nature of sin in Paul's writings, and when I read Paul, and the whole Bible frankly, I see a much different, albeit related, depiction. And do you think our modern conceptualization of sin is an overreaction to avoid dualism? It's a really good two questions here. I think the problem with a lot of apocalyptic Paul people, or at least the arguments, I should say. I'm not saying it's a problem with people; it's a problem with arguments. Is a way of kind of ordering certain texts or concepts, and you're looking for a very specific paradigm. And what happens often is you find a very specific method of argumentation in Paul's letters. So the example I just alluded to with Romans 7, but you take Romans 5 through 8 as its own unit, right? The presentation of sin there often has notions of agency, or sin has some sort of will or power. And so you can't rightly call sin something we do. Sin has some sort of carnivorous agency, intelligence. It's a power of sorts. You might think of it as a demonic or supernatural or extra-natural force. So it's not just something we do. It's a bigger, scarier thing than that. That's why charismatic or Pentecostal theologies of demonology have a very robust view of these sorts of things. Right or wrongly, they at least acknowledge that sin is a bigger thing. Of course, that doesn't mean the devil made you do everything, but that's sort of the apocalyptic Paul kind of conception of sin as a power, and they're less concerned with individualized sin or even acts of sin. They're more concerned with kind of the overarching meta narrative of sin as a power. The problem is, and as Joey's getting here, is I do think that in some sense colonizes a lot of the data, because I think sin in the New Testament is both a power and something that human persons engage in. And so you might think of sin as it's a silly image, but sin, I was playing with Nolan on the grass, and we touched a tree and we got sap on our fingers, and we're nowhere near a faucet to wash it off. And so I had to walk around the whole day with sap on my fingers, and eventually it got less sticky, but it got everywhere. It got on his face because he grabbed it and touched himself and stuff. I often picture sin as being both the person or thing that touches you with sap and also the sap itself that gets everywhere, but also the impulse within us that takes our hand and puts the sap everywhere else. And so I see sin in the New Testament as being both individualized as something that agents do to one another, as well as mindsets or acts, ways of thinking that are sinful. That's why Paul and Joe and I talked about this. Having the mind of Christ in Philippians 2 is integral to the Christian life. It's integral to Christian ethics, because, or Romans 8, the mind set on the flesh or the mind set on the spirit, ways of thinking or walking or acting. I think sin in the New Testament, broadly conceived, is both a power and is an act based on that power or that principality. And so I think our definition of sin as missing the mark doesn't capture kind of the radical, scary nature of sin in the New Testament. But just because sin is radical and scary in the New Testament doesn't mean it negates human agency, human activity, human complicity in sin, human desires that have gone off the rails, or corruption, or what have you. And so I think our definition of sin often in evangelicalism is things we do to each other, and we don't see the bigger picture of sin. Understanding sin often requires a bigger picture, and that's why the apocalyptic Paul people at least have the right idea that they're looking for a bigger picture. The problem is the bigger picture often comes at the expense of individual pieces that don't necessarily fit that picture. And maybe what Joey and I and others are trying to kind of get at is that sin requires a bigger picture, but not at the expense of the pieces. So maybe we need to look at these pieces and see the trees for the forest rather than the forest for the trees. And so I think our fear of, or at least our modern conceptualization of sin as trying to avoid dualism, I think a lot of it is, I think that's really wise, because a lot of what passes for modern life in the church or whatever, the fear of Gnosticism, or this idea of, or not even Gnosticism, scratch that, the idea of the supernatural. We do live in kind of an age that is, hey, I threw a little piece of plastic. Hey, knock it off. It's time to sleep. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you can blink at me all you want. I know what you were doing. Pinning down a defenseless cat. Anyway. Yeah, I think modern evangelicalism really does lack a lot of substance as it relates to demonology or principalities, powers, because we've kind of bought into the paradigm of, we're kind of ashamed to say the devil made me do it, in which case most of the time that's probably true, but not every time. The devil's not an excuse to get you out of something, but the fact that you believe the devil made you do something should terrify you, because sin is scary and the devil is scary, and we shouldn't kind of run away from the supernatural kind of reality of sin. But we shouldn't use it as an excuse to kind of get ourselves out of the sinful sap we've touched everything with. So I think given human agency, human free will, we might say, or human complicity in sin, we need to have a more robust view of that without negating the supernatural element of sin or the principalities and powers of sin. Next question. Where do people come up with the different definitions of God's will, i.e. sovereign, permissive, etc.? And that's from my buddy Stu. It's a good question because a lot of it probably comes from our theological or historical traditions. A lot of the human-made, systematic theologies, depending on if you're reading Hodge or Shedd or Grudem or Calvin or Wesley or Aquinas, all of us are building on the bricks laid by them. And they're building on the bricks laid by them. And you essentially have two usually distinct but not necessarily distinct kind of ways of thinking on this. One is the uncritical adoption of labels and definitions in theological debate that just kind of go unchecked or unchallenged. People are kind of willing to just accept them and move on to make a bigger point or write their book or do their dissertation or whatever. And then you have other people, and this is big in analytic theology and analytic philosophy, is what they do is essentially every word or every phrase is contested. You can say something like God is love. Okay, well, what is love? Well, love is this. Well, what is that? It's kind of the joke I would say is in John, I forget exactly what chapter, but Jesus makes a statement to Pilate, and then Pilate answers or counters with, well, what is truth? Pilate's just being a good analytic theologian there. He's doing analytic theology. And so you have those kind of, and I'm not saying they have to be distinct, but they generally tend to be separate spheres, separate tracks in the Christian tradition. And what I'd like to see, and what I try to do is, if we use a definition for something, we at least try to critically go, okay, wait, let's back up a little bit. Let's try and look at the foundations that we've laid. Are these sound? Do we need to level the house but keep the foundation? For example, the doctrine of sin. Or do we need to just bulldoze everything, set it on fire, light it on dynamite, piss on the ashes, and just completely move on? What is required of us to get back to what Scripture seems to suggest? And I think a lot of people are debtors to theological and historical traditions, and that's not a bad thing. It's only a bad thing. It sounds a little like Proverbs there, but it's not a bad thing. But it can be a bad thing when it's uncritically accepted. And I think for a lot of us, there is a lot to be thought about as it relates to reframing theology, reframing kind of our theological assumptions and presuppositions, and allowing Scripture to challenge them. And that's something I try to do, talk about in, and I don't think I'm immune from this by any stretch. Last I checked, I'm not fully sanctified. I can tell because I can just tell. But I think there's just a lot to be said about being willing to reframe and reflect on the very definitions or the rhetoric we use. The language we use is often very, comes with a lot of baggage. And a lot of those definitions come from different people in different theological traditions using the same words but different dictionaries. So you'll have people say God is sovereign, and then you're left going like, okay, but what does that mean? And the analytic theologian is screaming, in the corner, she's screaming while pulling her glasses off and yanking on her hair and going like, what is sovereign? What is this thing? What is this definition? Is this true? Is this accurate? Does this reflect things? And, and I think we're kind of getting away from the idea of, just the assertion of language without any substantial justification for that definition. And so maybe in 5 to 10 years, we'll see a reset on that. That'd be my hope. And if you're doing it right, usually it's in conversation with other sides of the Christian tradition, the sides of the Christian family. So, next question, Ezekiel. I was curious as to what other theological or doctrinal differences you and Allison, my wife, have either in the past or continue to have besides the complementarian egalitarian differences you had when you first met. Yeah, she was egalitarian, I was not. If there have been, still are any difference, how have you worked to continue to work through them, and how serious do these differences become for you? I'm not going to out her theologically. Just I don't want to get her in trouble. I mean, she's not like, it's fine. It's just I forgot to ask her if I could talk about some of these, but there are certain topics where on secondary or tertiary issues where her and I at least have different ways of thinking. Uh, she would not be classified as a physicalist. Although I'm not sure at this point if I would be. I hold to my physicalism tentatively at this point, but she wouldn't be classified as a physicalist, although she's not opposed. She has a very robust view of the body and resurrection and anthropology and stuff like that. So she's not a physicalist. You can't categorize her as a pure substance dualist, but she's also more engaged in systematic theology and philosophy than I am. So she knows the debate. She knows what people are arguing and talking about. But she would not be classified as a physicalist, and it has really no implication for literally anything. For us, it's more something we like to talk about and joke about, occasionally argue about. And by argue, I mean mostly joking. It's a really good question because we really don't have. When we got married, we had different views on like a lot of secondary issues, or when we were dating is probably better. We ironed a lot of it out before we got married. Not that you have to, but I suppose, I mean, she was always she always affirmed the that Paul wrote all 13 letters. I toyed with the idea of the 7 genuine Paulines. Then I moved to the 10, and now I'm kind of at the 13. So we didn't always agree on that, but now we do. But that was something we really never talked about. When I considered universalism for about 4 months, she didn't think I was a heretic or going to hell or anything, but it was one of those where she had questions and arguments, and at the end of it, I was like, in addition to some of these points, I did my own research and reading and translating, and was like, well, that's not going to work theologically, or at least in my mind, exegetically. There are people that find it exegetically compelling. I don't. But one of the things we noticed early on was there are doctrinal debates or theological debates that you can have that impact a marriage, interpersonal dynamics, all that sort of stuff. But theologically, if you're egalitarian, or when we got married, we were egalitarian. That I think is more vital to a marriage, just because that directly impacts, of course, it impacts sex, it impacts desire, it impacts how you even think about those sorts of things. It impacts who's in charge, who does what. And so those things, I can imagine having those, if I were complementarian still and she were egalitarian, that would be a real difficult time. I don't consider myself an overlord. I've never been that type of person. I'm not. My disposition is more collaborative than being the one person being in charge. Although if I need to be in charge, I'm content being in charge. My instinct was always to go where the text led, but my instinct was always I'd rather have a partner than be the boss, so to speak. And so there's a nuance there, but that could be sussed out. But that debate took some time to figure out. But and that comes, of course, with prayer and integrating conversation and just giving each other grace and time. A lot of people don't give the other spouse time to reflect and pray, because let's face it, if you think you're right, you want them to agree with you and change their mind, and that's true across the board. But the few differences or nuances we have really no bearing on our relationship interpersonally. The closest one would have been the egalitarian complementarian divide, and that we figured out. We didn't figure out how to live it until marriage, with all the stuff that comes with marriage. But while we were dating and going through all that, we figured out, okay, this is how we react to each other. This is how we talk to one another. And I would submit to you that our marriage is a lot better had we then had I remained a complementarian and she remained egalitarian. I think she's certainly happier, and I know I'm happier. So, but I don't think we don't have any major differences, at least as far as I can see. Um, she feels strongly on certain views that I don't, even if we agree, and that's vice versa. I was always more concerned with authorship questions than she was. Did Paul write Ephesians? How many Isaiahs are there? And who wrote Hebrews? I cared about that stuff at the very beginning of seminary. Then I kind of stopped caring after that. Yeah, a lot of it was just taking time, reflecting, engaging, being willing to be wrong, knowing when to debate and when to listen and when to talk and when to just know that you're just having a conversation. You're not trying to persuade them. And so yeah, those are some things that we kind of went through together, and I think we're better off for. Matt asks, what do you do? He wants a question on ecclesiology. Is there one set structure put forth in the New Testament or multiple? I see a lot of people trying to get back to a, quote, early church style, quote, church setting. So, the early church models or movements. I'm not sure it's even possible to do that. It's a really good question. I think there's two things to be said. One is there is a vision of early church ecclesiology. And the vision is theological. And that is, of course, there are certain things you have to affirm. Jesus came in the flesh. John, the epistles of John are very clear on that, those sorts of things. But the body of Christ has kind of the glue that binds together the differing ecclesiologies we see in the New Testament. So you have a singular vision and multiple expressions. And so the way I see it is the New Testament has numerous ecclesiologies, but one body. Ephesians 5, even 1 Corinthians 12, the many members, but one body. We're many members, but we are the one flesh, so to speak. At least Paul's vision of the church seems more contingent and contextual than we might like. I think the idea of going back to an early church model doesn't make a lot of sense. So, for example, just to show differing ecclesiologies, in the pastoral epistles, and this is a reason why people don't think Paul wrote them, is they present a more household of God, hierarchical ordering of the church. And I think that's a bit overblown, or a little over kind of interpreted, but let's just roll with that just for the sake of argument, which kind of presents the church, and we would say, and the joke is, it looks more like a CEO model than it does what we see in, say, 1 Corinthians, where you've got you have the charismata, you have the pneumatic communities, the women prophesying, the men prophesying, teachers, different people doing all sorts of things. There's Paul's concern isn't on a CEO model, but on right activity within the pneumatic reality, right? Where the charismatic movements and the elements are going. And so you have, it's not to say they are contradictory, but they are contextual, meaning, to put it plainly, the women and men in 1 Corinthians are not given the same model as the men and women in the pastorals. They are not, and the same thing applies to Romans. If we go to Romans for ecclesiology, you're not going to find a ton of it. But what Romans, I think, does is Roman doesn't give us a model for ecclesiology. It gives us a vision for ecclesiology. So Romans, we all we like arguing about sin and for the first 4 chapters, and we love talking about grace in the next 4 chapters, and we love talking or not talking about all the crazy stuff about Israel in the next 3 chapters, and then we get to the ethics, so to speak, in chapter 12 and following, and people just roll their eyes and they don't care, because who cares about ethics when you can have theology? Never mind the fact that your theology, wittingly or unwittingly, dictates your ethics, but that's a separate point. But when you get to Romans, say 12, therefore present your bodies as a living sacrifice, or your the greetings to the men and women in Romans 16, or the strong and the weak, all these sorts of issues, Caesar, dealing with, the Roman government in Romans 13, not repaying vengeance for vengeance in Romans 12. You don't see a model for ecclesiology. Here's how you do church. He assumes that they're doing church and reminds them of the vision. And the vision has ethical implications and ethical imperatives, but is not fixed on an order or a structure. So the vision is on ethics and interpersonal relationships and dynamics. It is not fixed on how or where these things take place. And there is evidence, and I'd have to go back and really look. I don't remember where I read this, so give me a little leash on this one. I want to... Can I just look right now? Let's see. Let's see if I've Googled the right thing. I don't know. I think I may have found it. If this is the one I read, okay. I remember reading this paper. I don't have a copy of it in front of me. You can Google this, but it's Edward Adams. He's at King's College of London. He's a New Testament scholar. The paper is called "Were the Pauline Churches House Churches?" Were the Pauline Churches house churches? And he seems to, and I think he's working on, I can't remember if it was a monograph, but he's done work on this. And he seems to suggest, basically the conclusion is, from what I recall, is the family language and the use of oikos or oikon, or oikon or ecclesia or something like that, does not necessarily imply houses as meeting places. There's a much broader range of possible meanings for that. He looks at anyway. It's all this to say. Going back to the whole idea of house churches, that doesn't seem to be the required distinct vision of the early church. And I use the word vision there specifically. It can be a model because, for example, I can go to Philemon. Adams talks about Philemon. And he says, Paul says to Philemon, and I can't wait to do my video on Philemon, by the way. It begs the question, first one, to Philemon, our dear friend and co-worker, to Apphia, the sister, to Archippus, our fellow soldier, and the church in your house. And so the your is singular in Greek, su, right? So the question is are all these people in the same house? Or is Paul writing to the church that meets in Philemon's house? Because that's probably the most likely. I mean, just grammatically, it's probably the most likely, but you can see there's a bit of an ambiguity there. Is he talking about the meeting in your house, meaning all three of y'all? Or is he speaking of the church that meets in Philemon's house? Because Philemon's addressed first, and Philemon is the recipient of the epistle, probably delivered by Onesimus. Hint, hint, that video is going to be a lot of fun. I can't wait to do that video. But point being, the church in your house. So whatever the case may be, let's say it's Philemon. If Philemon's there, then you have Apphia and Archippus, probably leaders in the church or in the community. They probably have their own households because women usually ran the household. That's generally how it works. The men would do stuff out there. They'd go to war. They'd go and do all this sort of stuff. The women would they were the heads of the household. They were the household managers, so to speak. And they made sure the slaves were doing what they were doing. They made sure the kids were doing what they were doing. They bartered. They did the cooking. They did the books. They made sure they ran everything, And so I find it hard to believe that households were the exclusive meeting place. And as such, I think it's kind of dangerous to go, oh, we're going to follow that model when it's not necessarily a model. It seems to be, it's not to say you can't meet in your home. Doesn't mean you can't do anything like that. I'm 100% in favor of it. But let's not pretend that it is the prescribed exclusive model in the New Testament, because we don't usually have that. You have people meeting in synagogues. You have people meeting all over the place. It seems to be more about the people that are gathered in the vision versus the location. And of course, that has implications for the time we live in now, right? Online church. For me, there's something that is missing when you do it, but missing personally, not ethically. Like just for me, I like to be in a physical place with people. Worship. Oh my goodness. My phone is screaming, death, 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 the sweet, terrible thing. Well, I'll plug you in after all this. So I think the New Testament, if we look at first 1 Corinthians, we look at 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy. You look at Philemon, you look at Romans. All of them have the same sort of vision for ecclesiology, but they don't have the same model. And the model appears to be more based on the theological, interpersonal, and cultural needs of the particular community. The pneumatic community in 1 Corinthians is probably not as wealthy. And we can probably infer that from what Paul says in chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians. He says, "Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth." And so God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, and so on and so forth. And so these are probably not people that are considered high class. And with high class comes the issue of property or the owning of property. And so all this to say, I think there are many New Testament ecclesiologies, and they need to be understood in a contextual way, which gives us a bit of flexibility when it relates to our own construction, our own understanding of ecclesiology, or the model of ecclesiology, but it presents a unified vision of what ecclesiology means. The body of Christ, worship, songs, hymns, spiritual songs, spending time together, prophetic words, and that can look different. I mean, the vision has, the vision is the overlay or the paradigm or the framework for everything that follows. But the vision permits models to be constructed faithfully that may require contextual sensitivity, if that makes sense. And so I don't think there's one set structure or model, but I do think there's one set vision. And the visionary element should not be lost. So that's kind of where I go with that question. And people debate, elder rule or the Moses model or what have you. And I tend to look at them and go, I think a lot of the models that I see have a lot of, at least in the modern evangelical church, right? Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, non-denominational, i.e. Baptist, except without the name, evangelical covenant, pick whichever side you want. The thing I've noticed most is that maybe the model, and I'll end with this as just something for us to reflect on. Maybe the model needs to be thought of as, given the SBC sex scandal abuse, the ACNA, the Roman Catholic Church, and all the bad stuff that has come about through denominational oversight or missights, or just straight up sinful, not caring horror, that sort of thing. Maybe the model needs to be rethought on the basis of flaws that permit certain things like that, because those things at the end of the day strike at the heart of the vision presented in the New Testament that reveal the underbelly of, like I said, sin in our world. And so something for us to think about. Maybe our model of church should be rethought to include the issue and understanding of abuse, mistreatment of women, children, minorities, and on it goes. So maybe it's a way to, maybe we should rethink the models so that the vision remains integral and filled with integrity. I think I'm with you, Matt. I'm not sure it's possible to go back to an early church style, meaning a home church. I think it's perfectly reasonable for some people to do that and some churches to do that. As a unified exclusive model, or a primary or a necessary and exclusive model, I don't see that working. I think the New Testament gives us numerous models that we can use to further the kingdom of God provided we stay within the vision of the kingdom of God. So hopefully that helps. I think I agree with you, Matt. Or at least as far as I understand the question. I could be wrong on that. Let me know in the comments what you think. Ecclesiology is one of those things I find very interesting. Church polity, not so much. But at the end of the day, that's life. I'm weird like that. Ezekiel had another one. He asked, how do you keep track of the different scholarly debates going back and forth within the fields you're involved in? Is it a matter of just knowing where to look through your extended study, being subscribed to different publishers, sites, getting to know the scholars in the field and following their work? All the above? Yes, all the above. I don't know how other people do it, but for New Testament, and I fall in the realm of New Testament and systematic theology, obviously far more towards New Testament, but I like to think I'm theologically aware, and I care about theology. So that means you've got probably a dozen New Testament journals that I've been able to the past few weeks for obvious reasons, or for the past month for obvious reasons, but that I'm always checking to see what is released by them. So New Testament Studies, Journal of Biblical Literature, Journal of Theological Interpretation, Evangelical Quarterly, Journal for the Study of the New Testament, Journal for the Study of Paul and His Letters, Priscilla Papers, Scottish Journal of Theology, Tyndale Bulletin. Even JETS, Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society. I get those. I tend not to actually find them really that helpful. Catholic Biblical Quarterly, Australian Theological Review, Novum Testamentum, Journal of Theological Studies is an incredible one. Biblical Interpretation, Neo-Testamentica, Horizons in Biblical Theology is another one that integrates theology and biblical studies. There is Journal of Greco-Roman Christianity and Judaism is good. Harvard Theological Review I try to keep a look on. And so those are those for theology. Obviously, the International Journal of Systematic Theology, Evangelical Quarterly kind of does both. Evangelical Quarterly is really solid in that sense. What else? I can't remember which ones I mentioned. A new one that's coming up that I published in is the Canadian American Theological Review. They do systematic theology, philosophy, all that sort of stuff, New Testament studies. Maybe I'll just do this. I'll go on the spot. So, hello, NT Wright. Let's see if here we go. It's bibliography. Let's see. When in doubt, look for, does he have his... He has his bibliography, but no. Oh, I think I know what. So, Paul and the Hope of Glory by Constantine Campbell. A book that I generally enjoyed, but had a lot of quibbles with. And it's because he's an awesome theologian and New Testament scholar who, there it is, abbreviations. So when in doubt, come on, preface, yes, abbreviations. That's usually a good one. So this is actually a really helpful book here. Paul and the Hope of Glory, Exegetical and Theological Study, basically on Pauline eschatology. The parousia, the day of the Lord, all that sort of stuff. And this is a good intermediary text because it's academic, because it engages with academic literature, the cutting edge of what's being published. And he's a New Testament scholar who's done stuff on verbal aspect. What else has he done? He's known for verbal aspect. He taught at Trinity. Paul in Union with Christ, that was the book he did. But it's a book that a pastor, she could grab the book and read it and learn and go, oh, I can preach this. So I call it the best of both worlds. But the Anchor Bible Commentary series, from Yale. Let's see, the Baker Exegetical and then commentary series are also good. but let's see. Journal for the Study of the New Testament. Perspective is in Religious Studies, Scottish Journal Theology, Novum Testamentum. I probably said a lot of these. Sorry. Commentary series, I'll just add the ones I love. The Baker Exegetical Commentary series is very hit or miss for me. The International Greek New Testament Commentary series is hit or miss. And that's the problem with a lot of these commentary series. The Hermenia series, the Story of God Bible Commentary series, Word. It's one of those things, if you can get the whole set for real cheap, go for it. But in my mind, most commentary sets or series have a lot of hits and a lot of misses, and it really just depends. I think the one that I found most helpful, at least most consistent, is the International New Testament Commentary series. Do I have one over here? I do. Yeah, New International Commentary. Let's see. Yeah, the New International Commentary on the New Testament series. Those. And Gordon Fee's 1 Corinthians commentary, revised in maybe 10 years ago-ish. Best commentary ever written. Not because he's right on everything, but because you can read it and you'll love it and you'll fight with him, and it's wonderful. So, commentary series, they're just like journals. There's usually a couple really good journal articles in there, and there's a couple duds, and then there's a couple, oh, okay, yeah, that got published. That's cool. Good for the person that got published. So, I'm one to talk, with publications. That reminds me, I actually need to, oh gosh, I just realized I got 3 things I need to be working on, and what are the 3 things? I got caricature stuff with Ridley. I need to finish that probably this week. What else? Journal Theological Interpretation. I need to get that done. I have until April. And then I wanted to, it may be too late. I wanted to submit something to ETS because they're meeting in Ontario here. Probably not. I think it's probably too late. Submit paper proposal. Sorry, you get to see. This is the meat. This is how the Theology nerd is made. This is where the sausage is made. There we go. Let's see. I have until so I could do it today. It's technically 12:19 in the morning on Monday. If I did it today, I could probably get it in. Another thing to work on. Anyway, all this to say, I keep up with it. 1, pestering and following people. Follow Mike Bird. Najee Gupta is really good at this. He's at Northern. Greg Keener, Ben Witherington. Follow as many of them as you can. And if you're really cool, maybe they'll accept your friend request on Facebook. But if not, follow them on Twitter. See what they're doing. Get involved with IBR if you're able to, or ETS, and just follow the journals. That's probably the best way to do it. Just in trying to stay cutting edge with stuff without going insane. There's usually about 10 to 12 journals that you need to kind of keep up with. So, all the above. All right, so this one I think is interesting. This is from my buddy Chris. Chris asked, Keith Giles, who's a progressive Christian, has basically argued, and he's not alone in this, basically asserting that the first 400 years of the church were universalists, or the first 400 years of the church, universalism was the dominant view, or was the view. Let me actually pull up. He didn't phrase it in the form of a question. That's why I'm kind of chuckling to myself a little bit. Let me pull it up. Let's see. Where did it go? Where did it go? Oh yeah, so Giles said, did you know universal reconciliation was the majority view amongst Christians in the first 400 years of church history? Basically, what do I think about that? It wasn't an argument I found compelling when I was a universalist. It's an argument I never would have made. I find it really hard to substantiate that. I think the closest you get is I think Origen probably was universalist. Athanasius, the more I read Athanasius, sounds, this is going to sound, it's anachronistic, obviously, but we'll just roll with it. Sounds more like an Arminian, or Wesleyan. He's a proto-Wesleyan, death of Christ is for all people. God is doing all these things for all people. God desires all people to be saved, so on and so forth. But then there are passages where he sounds very much like a conditionalist or an annihilationist, which kind of makes him a Wesleyan conditionalist. So it's one of those, I think that's probably right. Tertullian, certainly not. Athenagoras, certainly not. Irenaeus, certainly not. Who else? Neither Clement the Didache. So I think it's incredibly difficult to substantiate that. And I think what we see, it's kind of the claim I see with a lot of, how do I phrase this nicely? Some of our Calvinist friends will basically go running to the early church, like the first 400 years, and try to find determinists under every rock. And I'll grant you Augustine. There are certain phrases where Clement sounds a little Calvinistic, but at the end of the day, I think most Calvinistic scholars are willing to grant, the first 400, 300, 500 years of the church, minus Augustine, not really conducive to our view. For me, the early church and eschatology and soteriology most commonly reflected the Judaism of the Second Temple period. And what I mean by that was there were disparate views, but there were certain views that were not held, at least commonly. Universalism, at least in the first 400 years, does not appear to be the dominant view, because usually when the literature I read that they cite, or the citations, if you keep reading, it sounds more like universal atonement versus universal salvation. And unless you presuppose a certain mechanism for God acting in the world, you can't just conflate the two. So I see a lot of people really trying to fit the early church fathers into a very specific ideological framework. And I think the early church fathers, like Second Temple Judaism, like the New Testament, has a lot of very diverse opinions. But the fact that I think you can probably find a few here or there, but I think to call it the majority view is kind of a how do I say this nicely? It smacks of fundamentalism, where we have to basically fit everything within a certain narrative. It plays into sort of narrativalism, which is kind of tribalistic. And I think it's better to go, there are a few here. It wasn't the dominant view, but it was a view that was held by Gregory of Nyssa. Yeah, Gregory of Nyssa. Definitely, probably universalist. Incredible theologian. Completely orthodox. Origen, weird. Still probably pretty orthodox, at least based on what we have. Not a whole lot beyond that. So I think at best you can say it was a minority report in the early church, and it should be accepted as an orthodox, albeit I think wrong, perspective in Christian theology. I think the problem I have, just as someone who's interested in scholarly literature and academia, I get really uncomfortable trying to fit everything into a very select paradigm. I think it's often better just to acknowledge the differences in whether it is certain texts or certain arguments. And I think it's kind of revealing, once you leave, it's one of those things, either you leave fundamentalism or you don't. But if you don't leave fundamentalism, but you become, say, a conservative Christian, after you were progressive, you haven't left fundamentalism. You've basically just painted yourself a different color. You've gone from red to blue or blue to red. And I think a lot of people don't do the reflective work to actually look through that. Because fundamentalism as a mindset is very difficult to get rid of. And fundamentalism usually dictates seeing the world in black and white ways, reading history in black and white ways, thinking that your view has always been correct when, say, it originated with Darby, 100 or 200 years ago, or it arose, 500 years after the early church, or whatever. I don't need the early church to be annihilationist or eternal torment or universalist. I think they're diverse and disparate enough to where I think they're more interesting than that. So I think as a former X-ish universalist, it's not an argument I would have ever made. And when I saw it being made, I never found it. I didn't find it to be substantive. my case was usually exegetical and theological, and once I read Second Temple literature, that kind of fell away too. So all this to say, I think not only is that a very I think it's a bad way to do history, but not only is it a bad way to do history, I kind of object to this whole idea of people doing the whole, well, no one has ever thought this, or, oh, look at this. It's kind of fundamentalist conspiracy theoryisms. It's like, this view was suppressed, or this was this. And it's like, okay, like, do we really need to go down this route? Maybe the world is just more complicated than what we like to think. So I think we should view the early church with more awareness of the complexity than reducing it all down. As for the actual evidence that I've seen presented, it's not true. It's not the majority opinion. It's at best a minority report, and based on the credibility of certain theologians, Gregory of Nyssa, happy to grant that it's orthodox. You can be orthodox and wrong. God love you. So that's my answer to that. So the next one, Ezekiel said, and this is, I thought, was this. So these two I'll answer together, and then we'll be done. I've already taken up over an hour of your time. Oh, I like my new intro, by the way, and outro. Ezekiel asks, I've heard you say in previous videos that you definitely believe the gifts of the Spirit have continued and are still in operation today, but you just don't practice them. That's what I've said, or at least I haven't been made aware that I have them and can therefore use them. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I know this isn't your field of study, but I was wondering whether you find any validity to cessationist arguments at all. I personally don't, but I'm still in the early stages of studying this topic and come from a continuationist background, so I could very well be biased. I am, however, grateful for the pushback from cessationists, as it has helped continuationists be more astute and rigorous in theology and practice. Amen. At least the non-hypercharismatics. And he said, related to the above, I didn't find Chris State's recent video on the gift of tongues very persuasive, i.e. that it's just human languages that we didn't know before and definitely not a heavenly language. For a few reasons, but I was curious on your thoughts on the gifts of tongues and whether you agree with Date's conclusion. So I'll take the first one, then the second one. I believe that the gifts are still in operation. I'm a continuationist. I'm charismatic in the sense that I believe the Spirit gives these gifts. I don't know about offices. I'm a little wary on offices, but even then I can see them. I often think we think too much of offices like CEOs versus the function or calling. We often think of offices as something you're elected to. I prefer to think of the language of calling or gifted. And even then, I don't think if you're called and gifted to something, that usually requires the whole church to sign off on it, and not only sign off on it, but see it in you and sign off on it. It's very easy to kind of drum that sort of stuff up. I think the one thing cessationists do that is helpful is help continuationists like myself look at other continuationists and go, yeah, excessive. Spit, I don't know, an example, spit in your hand, rubbing it on someone's face. I don't know if this person's continuationist, or I'll just use that as an example because it's one of those where, spit in your hand, rub it on someone's face to make a theological point. Okay, maybe continuationists don't have to make that. Maybe we can look at that and be like, and I don't know the pastor. I don't know if he's continuing. I have no idea who he is. I'm just using that act as an example. It's like one of those where we say that, yeah, maybe we shouldn't do that. So maybe we can sand the edges off of this and make it a little more theologically, as you said, Ezekiel, rigorous. It's a good word for it. I don't find, the language of the close of the canon. I think it's a terrible argument. I don't think it's grounded in the text. I think it presupposes basically its own conclusion. The idea that I forget the exact text it is, so I'm not going to cite it. But the text, and I think I know what text it is. Let me see. See if I can remember. See if I got it right. I think I know what it is. Oh, yep. 1 Corinthians 13:10. But when the complete or perfect comes, the partial will come to an end. And they take complete or perfect, or the partial. They take this as a reference to the closing of the canon and all these sorts of things. Prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come as well. And so this passage is interpreted as referring to the cessation of these gifts because of the closing of the canon, or at least that's how it's kind of in a pop level kind of used. It's not to say there aren't more academic material on it, and they might have some points that are worth considering, but as an argument, I think that's not. I think there's no contextual reason to accept that argument here. It doesn't arise naturally from the context, or anything like that. And so it's one of those. I don't find cessationist arguments from a biblical or exegetical standpoint to be compelling. I think it's I think it's unwise to throw out entire theologies based on what some excesses are seen, without basically allowing the people to trim the excesses. We saw this with Strange Fire, where John MacArthur is very content to just scorched earth everything, as he's wont to do with people he disagrees with. You should see what he says about egalitarians. Fun. Don't worry. We'll get to heaven and we'll see which one is right, and the Lord will be happy to tell us. But I think that whole scorched earth thing, it did two things. One, revealed the prejudice of many cessationists as it relates to continuationists. I think a lot of it is prejudiced. But also, two, it caused continuationists to look at other continuationists and be like, maybe don't spit in people's faces. Maybe don't ride around in gilded jets and cars, stuff like that, So, you can take the criticism for what it is, but at the end of the day, maybe we can look at ourselves and be like, let's be reflective about this. Let's be smart about this. Ezekiel, you're right, rigorous. Let's be more rigorous about this. So I don't find cessationist arguments compelling at all. As for Chris, I think human languages, I think that's included. I don't think it's one of those where I'm like, yeah, I think it probably can include that. I don't see why it would negate heavenly languages or other kind of ideas like that. Certainly the texts are broad enough, and other kind of contexts are broad enough to include that. And so in my mind, I usually try to, rather than an either or, I try to see it as a both and. Human languages, I think, are a part of it. I don't think they really, they're not the whole story, but I think they are integral to that. But I think heavenly language, or spirited language, we might call it, or whatever you want to call it, prophetic language, is certainly part of it as well. And I think Paul is more concerned with excesses in that than he is with human languages. For me, I try to be more integrative, so I think it's a both and. I don't know if that helps. And I don't know if Chris would even necessarily disagree with that, if pressed. I didn't watch his video, so I can't comment on it, but I know the argument. And Chris, I think he's a continuationist. He just takes this view. It's not like it's an unreasonable view. I just don't think it accounts for everything. So it's one of the things I think it's correct in what it affirms, and if Chris denies the other bit, incorrect in what it denies. So, ironically enough, I haven't done as much work as I want on the gifts of the Spirit. I've read a few continuationist books. I read Tom Schreiner's book, didn't find it compelling. I read a lot of Tom Schreiner's work in Calvinism, Women in Ministry. This one, I'm one of those. I'm like, wow, I'm glad I read that. I don't agree with any of this. It's one of those where it's like, boy, I'm very grateful to have read that, and I disagree with everything in the book. Well, not everything in the book. He believes Jesus is Lord. Obviously, we agree with that. So yeah, what a wide-ranging, women in ministry, universalism, spiritual gifts, ecclesiology, Adam and Eve, sin, definitions of theology, all that sort of stuff, marriage. Like, shoot, Allison, I should just have Allison on here. We talk about marriage and dating tips. Totally be on board for that. Boy, I'm shiny. I even showered and cleaned up. Anyway. Thanks, everyone, for being here. This is, honestly, it was a great day spent with Allison and Nolan and the cats. Thank you for being here. Thank you for encouraging me with these questions. I love being called to think more deeply about things that matter, especially that matter to you. And if I can be a resource to help, that's a blessing to me. Hopefully this blesses you as you've blessed me with this. Again, thanks to my new patrons, and thanks for all the patrons who hung out yesterday and spent some time hanging out together. Thank you for helping the new video do really well. Thank you for helping this tiny little experiment of a YouTube channel grow. Um, yeah, man, this is an experiment, and prayer. If you wouldn't mind, you can see the boxes. We'll be moving in. Well, this will drop this morning, so Monday, today. But if you can just keep us, we'll be moving in about 10 or 11 days, and it's going to be a trip. Getting everything moved in, moving 3 cats and a baby. Well, not a baby, a toddler, and looking for work. And it's one of those where this week we're probably going to find out how much longer we're going to be in California, or if we're going to stay around, or all that sort of stuff. It's one of those where this week may determine what happens for the next part of our life. So it's an important week for us, just with jobs and ministry opportunities. So if you could just keep us in prayer, I'd really appreciate it. I know many of you are praying, and I try to pray for all of you as well. But just keep us in prayer that we would hear what the Lord is doing, and we would do what the Lord desires that we do. And that's something we are trying very desperately to do. And thank you for helping this channel grow. We're almost halfway to 1,000 subs. We're well over 2,000 watch hours. Yeah, as the famous philosopher theologian said, to infinity and beyond. God bless everyone. I'll talk to you later. Bye.